So the last key term here in part 1 is Presbyterians, Quakers, and Labadists. And obviously with all the key terms, when you have to explain something like that on a test, it's not looking for you to give me some internet definition of what a Presbyterian, Quaker, and Labadist is, but instead to talk about their context in Maryland, here in the time period in which that key term fits. So remember, Lord Baltimore, Cecil, still back in England, and Governor Charles Calvert here in Maryland. And after the Calverts are back in power and the Puritans out of power, it seems like there was a concerted effort to try to attract more diverse religious groups to Maryland so as to dilute the power of Puritans in particular and Anglicans to a lesser extent. I'm not sure if that made sense. If it did, just nod at me. I can't see you. Okay, I'll try again, just in case that didn't make sense. If each religious group sort of wants to be in power, then if that religious group is the majority of the population, then they could have a better chance of taking power. But if there are a bunch of religious groups, and each of them makes up a small proportion of the total, then each of them might think that leaving everybody alone is a good idea. Whichever one of those made more sense, use that one. Or ask me in class. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these groups. And we'll start with the Presbyterians. So, quick review. There you go. And you've seen the future. The Presbyterians are Protestants. Remember, all these groups are Protestants unless they're Catholics, and Catholics aren't. The Presbyterians were a Protestant group who were persecuted in England and in Scotland. They were persecuted by Anglicans when Anglicans controlled the government. And then, remember, Puritans ruled England during the Civil War, and during that period, Presbyterians were persecuted by Puritans. So, some Presbyterians fled England and Scotland and made their way to Maryland for religious toleration. Other Presbyterians were captured and shipped to Maryland as part of the indentured servant trade, which we'll talk more about when we get to part 2. Regardless of how they got to Maryland, Presbyterians began arriving in the mid-century, and then those numbers increased after 1660. The most important figure in early Presbyterian religious history in Maryland is this guy Francis Makemie, a Scottish missionary who comes to Maryland in 1683, and from lots of the accounts was incredibly charismatic and helped establish a bunch of Presbyterian churches, in particular out on the Eastern Shore. And if we back up for just a second to that map here, remember these counties that are established out on the Eastern Shore in the 1660s? Somerset, Dorchester, Talbot. These were growing quickly, partially because that's where places like the Presbyterians were moving in. It also made sense that Presbyterians moving into Maryland in that time period would settle the eastern shore, just if you think about it logically, because, backtracking again, people had already settled the good lands on the western shore of the Chesapeake. So, right, you're moving in, you're a migrant in a new land, you settle down in here. So, Francis Makemie also traveled throughout the colonies from Maryland and helped establish Presbyterian churches in other colonies too. But we don't care as much because, they weren't in Maryland. I'm joking. Obviously, they're very important, but Maryland. So, Quakers. One last thing I should say. Makemie, apparently, in his preaching, was actually pretty harsh in his condemnations of other Christian sects. So, denounced the Anglicans, certainly denounced Catholics, but denounced, the other Protestant groups too. And that included the Quakers, who he disparaged as, having the wrong interpretations. If you don't know from your own experience or from the class so far, people thinking that they have the right interpretation and other people don't is pretty common. So, the Quakers, again, moving in the 1660s and settling out here in particular on the eastern shore. The Quakers had 4 meeting houses out here in Talbot County by the 1660s. The Quakers, I don't know if we've talked about Quakers at all yet, maybe I've mentioned them, but I should explain a little bit to understand how remarkable it is that Quakers found the toleration that they did in Maryland. Quakers, I know that we did talk briefly about the Protestant Reformation and the idea that people should be their own priest in Martin Luther's formulation. So Quakers developed in the mid-1600s in England, and the founder was this guy George Fox, and Quakerism tried to really take Luther's ideas as seriously as you could. So the idea that one should be their own priest meant that, well then, if we take that seriously, well, we don't need priests, right? We should all do it ourselves. To do that, you had to be able to read the Bible and to interpret it for yourself. And so Quakers de-emphasized religious hierarchy, the idea that you need a priest or a minister to tell you things, and empowered the individual Quaker. So Quakers didn't and don't have churches. They're Christians, but don't have churches. They have what they call meeting houses. As you can see in some of the historical markers here, meeting house, meeting house. A meeting house, like you see here, is very expressly not a church. There's no minister. Instead, Quakers sit on benches inside the meeting house, and they sort of study their own inner light. Some might be reading their Bible, some just in quiet prayer, reflection. And within the meeting house, every Quaker had, the same kind of religious authority, the same kind of religious voice. And that, radically, included Quaker women. In almost all of established Christianity, women were expected to be quiet. But in Quakerism, women had a religious voice. And back in England, Quakers were pretty quickly persecuted because Quakers, in their interpretation of the Bible, were pacifists. They wouldn't engage in violence. And that means if the king says, "You have to fight for me," they say, "Sorry, I don't fight." If Parliament says, "You have to fight for us," they say, "Sorry, I don't fight." So that got them into all kinds of trouble from both angles. And you can imagine in this context how this also causes a lot of trouble. Quakers wouldn't swear an oath. You know how you have to swear oaths of loyalty? They wouldn't do it. That means, they won't swear an oath of loyalty to the king. And when Parliament comes around and says, "Swear an oath of loyalty to the king," "Swear an oath of loyalty to Oliver Cromwell," they won't do it. So Quakers, persecuted in England, found a place in Maryland. And like I said, first settling in the new lands out in Talbot County, they then found some success converting Puritans, which other Puritans really didn't like, converting Puritans across the bay over in Anne Arundel County. So they established some more meeting houses over there. So remember, they first start coming in the 1660s, 4 meeting houses over here. Then by the 1670s, they've got 15 meeting houses, most of them Talbot and Anne Arundel County. The Quakers, that is, wanted to be able to do what was called double affirm in the Maryland courts instead of having to swear. So, do you swear you will tell the truth? Yes, I swear I will tell the truth. That's an oath. They won't do it. But they would do this. Will you tell the truth? Yes. And then you could ask them again, will you tell the truth? Yes. In both cases, they're telling you yes, but not swearing. So that's what they wanted to do. Give us a special exemption so you don't violate our religion. And twice, Lord Baltimore, or Baltimore's council, told them no. Can't do that for you. It's too much. But on other issues, Quakers did get special exceptions from Lord Baltimore. They were exempted from service in the militia. We'll talk more about how the militia worked in part 2, but military service in the colony was required of every able-bodied male, but Quakers got essentially a religious exemption. And remember how everybody in Maryland had to swear an oath of loyalty to Lord Baltimore? Well, Lord Baltimore told the Quakers, "You guys don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. You're cool. Instead of swearing loyalty, all you have to do, or instead of swearing your allegiance, all you have to do is just promise your loyalty." It's like a difference in language. But they got a special dispensation of language that satisfied the Quaker conscience. And with that exception, Quakers were then eligible to vote, and eligible to hold office. That made Maryland the only colony that allowed Quakers those rights, except Rhode Island. I know we haven't talked much about Rhode Island, but distinctive history there. But the other colonies up and down the Atlantic coast all denied Quakers those rights. So in the 1670s, there were a bunch of Quakers elected to office. In 1672, George Fox actually came to Maryland, and that helped spread the faith. In the 1680s, as you'll see, there was a colony established by a Quaker, and partially connected to that, in Maryland politics, Quakers began to withdraw from political life. And sometimes they even let themselves get ripped off in court because they wouldn't go to court and swear. So a brief period of relatively big Quaker involvement in politics that then recedes in the 1780s. And finally, next, we'll end with the Labadists.